John Bennett was angry. Because John Bennett had turned against the prophet and done other bad things, he was excommunicated from the church and was no longer the mayor of Nauvoo. Joseph Smith became the new mayor. John Bennett became bitter. He left Nauvoo and began to say and write bad things about Joseph Smith and the church. He also got other people to join him. Joseph Smith told some of the men of the church that the saints would have more trouble. Someday they would have to leave Nauvoo. Joseph foresaw that they would go to the Rocky Mountains and build cities there. They would obey God and become a strong people.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Autumn into winter 1842 was a tumultuous time in Nauvoo. Most of September was spent in meetings instructing the various elders on how to preach Joe's history in order to put out the fires set by Reckitt Bennett's lectures. Most of September, Joe was confined to the home, caring for Emma, who was nearing death due to illness. This was common of the day. People taking ill would reach a certain point and be announced as taken into death, even though they weren't quite dead yet. Emma wasn't quite that far gone, but she succumbed to an unknown disease at the beginning of the month, and Joe's journal is replete with entries throughout all of September, October, and even into November of him caring for her. It's tough to know what may or may not have afflicted various people at this time. I mean, I would postulate that Joe's life at this time involved possibly dozens of sexual partners, and maybe that had something to do with it. I mean, think about a day in Joe's life at the end of 1842. He spent his time in Nauvoo away from the public eye. He won the favor and pity of anybody who believed the prophet was persecuted as the first Christians. Nay, even Jesus himself were. A couple of his wives lived with him at the time, but he had upwards of possibly 17 women who he had been wedded to by the end of this year. Now, those were merely the official sealings, which says nothing of his possible concubines. It should be no mystery why Emma sent so many notes to Joe telling him that she would be able to conceal and keep him safe at home. He was probably spending some nights out and leaving Emma a worried mess taking care of the kids in the household. Then he spends time at home. Emma falls ill with an unknown disease, and then, who knows? It was getting into wintertime as well, so it could be any number of colds or any, typical infections. Now, Joe's conduct at this time had thrown so many people under the bus by this point, people who'd been long trusted Mormon elites. The Hingepin Rigdon family was compromised in Joe's mind. Sarah Pratt had cast the prophet's reputation into question and had dragged Orson Brainpower Pratt into the fray. William and Wilson Law were speaking of Joe in less favorable terms than they were before. William Marks was a close confidant of Hingepin Rigdon and was a vicious antagonist of plural marriage. People who this time last year were trusted had no inkling of malfeasance by the prophet were seeing him in a whole new skeptical light. Who was a Bennett loyalist? Who was loyal to the prophet? Fealties required testing to verify that certain elites would stand by the prophet's side. Orson Pratt was first with an open letter that he sent on the 26th of September, 1842, which was published in the next issue of the Nauvoo Wasp. Editor of, Crazy Willie Smith, Joe's younger brother. Dear Sir, I noticed in last week's WASP a letter from Dr. Robert D. Foster, written from New York City, which states that Dr. John C. Reckitt Bennett had declared in said city that he had received a letter from me and from my wife, and that we were preparing to leave and expose Mormonism. I wish through the medium of your paper to say to the public that said statements are entirely false. We have never at any time written any letter or letters to Dr. John C. Bennett on any subject whatever. Neither are we preparing to leave and expose Mormonism, but intend to make Nauvoo our residence and Mormonism our motto. Respectfully, signed Orson Pratt. Hingepin Rigdon was next. His loyalty couldn't be tested by publishing an open letter in the WASP. Instead, he decided to go on an errand for the prophet to collect information. We'll talk about what this really means after I read it. Please bear with me. It's from the History of the Church, Dan Vogel edition, Volume 5, 154. October 5th, Elder Rigdon called Elder William Clayton into his office and said he had some matters to make known. He He had been at Carthage and had conversation with Judge Douglas, that's Stephen Douglas, opponent of Abraham Lincoln in the hotly contested presidential election prior to the Civil War, concerning Governor Carlin's proceedings, etc., and had ascertained that Carlin had intentionally issued an illegal writ, expecting thereby to draw President Joseph to Carthage to get acquitted by habeas corpus before Douglas, and having men there waiting with a legal writ to serve on Joseph as soon as he was released under the other one, and bear him away to Missouri without further ceremony. Elder Rigdon asked what power the governor's proclamation gave to any man or set of men who might be disposed to take President Joseph. He was answered, just the same power and authority which a legal warrant gave to an officer. It is more and more evident that Carlin is determined to have me taken to Missouri if he can. But may the Almighty Jehovah shield and defend me from all their power, and prolong my days in peace, that I may guide this people in righteousness until my head is white with old age. Amen. All the political conflicts discussed last episode were only escalating as Governor Carlin's term was nearing its end. He didn't want his otherwise good legacy sullied by the Mormon prophet continuing to go free as a fugitive within his district. Why did Hinchpin Rigdon travel to Carthage to gain this information in the first place? Well, that was due to some intel the Mormon hierarchy had come into contact with, which must have shown the urgency with which Governor Carlin was handling this last issue on his docket before he left office. From October 2nd, 1842. About 10 o'clock in the forenoon, a messenger arrived from Quincy, stating that the governor had offered a reward of $200 for Joseph Smith and also $200 for Orrin Porter Rockwell. This report was fully established on receipt in the mail papers. The Quincy Whig also stated that Governor Reynolds has offered a reward and published the governor's proclamation, offering a reward of $300 for Joseph Smith and $300 for Orrin Porter Rockwell. It is not expected that much will be affected by the rewards. Governor Carlin of Illinois, he didn't want his reputation sullied by the criminal empire raging in his state without any results. However, Governor Reynolds of Missouri was only 2 years into his 4-year term. He had made it his personal mission to apprehend the fugitives who attempted to take the life of his predecessor, Governor Lilburn Boggs. As a result of these motivations approaching vendettas, it seems that the history of the church claims that Governor Carlin had issued $200 bounties on Joe and Pistolpack and Porter, at the same time that Governor Reynolds had issued $300 bounties apiece. Yet here Joe concludes that, quote, it is not expected that much will be affected by the rewards. Yeah, $500 worth of bounties on each of them from 2 different state governors, not sheriffs, but governors, wouldn't result in anything? Just how safe did Joe think that he was? Don't forget, back in early September, when the sheriff searched the Smith home and Joe slipped out the back into the cornfield, he and a few of his posse said that they were there to take Joe dead or alive. Dead or alive versus $500 in bounties, those are 2 very different things. Dead or alive was usually only issued in cases of dangerous, violent criminals. Was Joe dangerous? Maybe not directly, but he had a militia of 2,000 fighting men who'd crowd the streets of Nauvoo at a moment's notice if they received word the prophet was in trouble. This made him incredibly dangerous. Yes, an armed criminal is dangerous, but a criminal with his own army is a force of nature. What I find interesting about this ordeal is the title of this section in the history of the church. It's, quote, plots to entrap Joseph Smith, end quote. Entrapment is something with a strict legal definition. When an undercover police officer persuades somebody to commit a crime who otherwise wouldn't have committed it and then arrest them for the crime, that's entrapment. The only way this works is by the colloquial definition of capturing somebody in a trap. But even that isn't a proper definition when we examine all the facts. What Joe and the history of the church call entrapment is merely attempting to execute an arrest warrant that was issued by the governor of the state. At no point is Joseph Smith called a fugitive in this whole ordeal, but that's exactly what he was. Being a fugitive doesn't necessarily mean the person is guilty of a crime. It merely means that they're actively evading arrest and the resulting trial which would ascertain guilt or innocence. Joseph Smith was a fugitive. However, he had some powerful allies on his side who saw what was really happening. One of these prominent allies was James Arlington Bennett, the newly appointed Major General and Inspector General of the Nauvoo Legion who lived in New York. Arlington Bennett sent a letter to his good friend and personal aide-de-camp, Gordon Bennett, who subsequently published this letter in his paper, the New York Herald. This letter really shows that Arlington Bennett saw what was happening from a 10,000-foot view. He knew what was happening. He knew the evidence Missouri had against Joe for the Lilburn Boggs assassination attempt, and he knew the reality of what persecution narratives create in religions. Arlington Bennett truly was an astute and intelligent observer of the events. Given the content of this letter, I'd be quicker to call Arlington Bennett a prophet than Joseph Smith a prophet. Now, referring to the previous letter exchange between Arlington and Joe, this is how the letter begins from the History of the Church, Volume 5, 157. Quote, "In this last letter, I expressed my regret that the quarrel between him and John C. Reckitt Bennett should have at all found its way into the public eye, this being the sole cause of placing him in his present awkward situation. I likewise commiserated with him in his affliction and signed myself at the conclusion of my letter as his friend, which I really am, and the friend of all good Mormons as well as other good men." Now, just to reiterate, this is a letter from Arlington Bennett to Gordon Bennett, who then published this letter in the New York Herald. "Why should I not be Joseph Smith's friend? He has done nothing to injure me, nor do I believe he has done anything to injure ex-Governor Boggs of Missouri. The governor, no doubt under strong feelings, may have thought and believed that Smith had preconcerted the plan for his assassination, but there is no legal evidence whatever of that fact, none by which an unprejudiced jury would convict any man. Yet, to send this man into Missouri under the present requisition would be an act of great injustice, and his ruin would be certain. How could any man, against whom there is a bitter religious prejudice, escape ruin, being in the circumstances of Smith? Look at the history of past ages. See the force of fanaticism and bigotry in bringing to the stake some of the best men, and in all these cases the persecutors had their pretexts, as well as in the case of the Mormon chief. Nothing follows its victim with such deadly aim as religious zeal, and therefore nothing should be so much guarded against by the civil power. Smith, I conceive, has just as good a right to establish a church, if he can do it, as Luther, Calvin, Wesley, Fox, or even King Henry VIII. All these chiefs in religion had their opponents and their people and their persecutors. Henry VIII was excommunicated, body and bones, soul and all, by His Holiness the Pope. Still, the Church of England has lived, as well as all the other sects. Just so it will be with the Mormons. They may kill one prophet and confine in chains half his followers, but another will take his place, and the Mormons will still go ahead. One of their elders said to me when conversing on this subject that they were like a mustard plant. If you don't disturb it, the seed will fall and multiply, and if you kick it about, you only give the seed more soil, and it will multiply the more. Undertake to convince them that they are wrong and that Smith is an impostor, and the answer is, laying the hand on the heart, I know in my own soul that it is true, and want no better evidence. I feel happy in my faith, and why should I be disturbed? Now I cannot see but what this is the sentiment that governs all religiously disposed persons, their object being heaven and happiness, no matter what their church and creed. They therefore cannot be put down while the Constitution of the United States offers them protection in common with all other sects, and while they believe that their eternal salvation is at stake. From what I know of the people, I fully believe that all the really sincere Mormons would die sooner than abandon their faith in their religion. General John C. Reckitt Bennett has stated that to conquer the Mormon Legion it would require 5-1 against them, all things taken into consideration, and that they will die to a man sooner than give up their prophet. Now is the arrest of this man worth such a sacrifice of life as must necessarily follow an open war with this people? The loss of from 1 to 3,000 lives will no doubt follow in an attempt to accomplish an object not in the end worth a button. Persecute them and you are sure to multiply them. This is fully proved since the Missouri persecution, as since that affair they have increased 100-fold. It is the best policy both of Missouri and Illinois to let them alone. For if they are drove further west, they may set up an independent government, under which they can worship the Almighty God as may suit their taste. Indeed, I would recommend to the prophet to pull up stakes and take possession of the Oregon Territory in his own right, and establish an independent empire. In 100 years from this time, no nation on earth could conquer such a people. Let not the history of David be forgotten. If the prophet Joseph Smith would do this, millions would flock to his standard and join his cause. He could then make his own laws by the voice of revelation and have them executed like the act of one man. With respect to myself, I would just repeat that I am the prophet's friend. Of course. Don't want to be an enemy to this kind of a person, do you? And the friend of his people, merely from sympathy, as my arm has ever been lifted on the side of the persecuted and oppressed. The Missouri persecution fixed my attention and commiseration on the people. It must be recollected, too, that the Mormon prophet and his people are the most ardent friends and promoters of literature and science. These are elementary principles in their social system, and this certainly is contrary to everything like despotism. Sure, you can hope that the more educated they are, the less despotic they will be. I think that's a little too high-minded. I hope, therefore, and with great deference express that hope, that ex-Governor Boggs will withdraw his demand for the prophet, and let those poor people rest in peace. Both he and Governor Carlin will feel much more at peace with themselves by quashing the whole proceeding. Signed, James Arlington Bennett. Now, I know that was a long read, but the entire letter is just so fascinating. Arlington Bennett saw the writing on the wall. He had no solution to put down the Mormon Empire other than simply allow it to flourish, because any action taken against the Mormons would fuel the persecution narrative and simply make more zealous converts. It's a vicious cycle. If they suffer enough persecution, they'll simply migrate west to Oregon and settle their own theocracy under the reign of Joseph Smith. Well, it wasn't Oregon or Joseph Smith, but the central point Arlington Bennett makes, it still held true. Just took Brigham Young and the Great Basin. Now, for the rest of the episode today, what we're going to do is a little bit different. I'm going to try my best to rapid fire all of the significant things that happened for the rest of 1842. Let's see if we can't wrap up 1842 and start off 2019 fresh in 1843. All of the following events transpired with the pressures that we've discussed thus far hanging over the Mormons' collective head. All the debt, no jobs, trade deficits, Joe evading arrest, Pistol Packin' Porter on the run, Reckitt Bennett's expose being published while he lectures around the nation, polygamy and hiding it from uninitiated Mormons, doctrinal developments with polygamy and with baptisms for the dead, political maneuverings preparing for the new governor and congressmen to take their positions, and many more issues and pressures that I won't articulate here. All of those pressures existed for the remainder of 1842, and we're going to be ripping through at light speed here. So, to begin, Joe had his scribe William Clayton publish an article in the Times and Seasons newspaper that an internal audit of the Nauvoo Temple Building Committee be conducted. It was found that everything was in proper order, but the Mormons were becoming more impatient with the slow progress of the temple, thus inciting the audit in the first place. The solution? Have the building committee install the first floor on the top of the existing foundation so the Mormons would have a regular place to meet during the coming winter instead of out in the grove where it's cold. The floor was laid with a new shipment of 90,000 feet of boards and 24,000 cubic feet of timber that arrived on Thursday, October 13th. Now, Joe took a trip to the temple October 29th to see how the completed floor looked. When he returned to his red brick store, he found an angry mob of Mormons there who had just arrived from New York with questions for him concerning the scandalous information Reckitt Bennett had revealed to the world. This was Joe's response, quote, I showed them that it was generally in consequence of the brethren disregarding or disobeying counsel that they became dissatisfied and murmured. And many, when they arrived here, were dissatisfied with the conduct of some of the saints. Oh, not with the prophet, just some of the saints. Because everything was not done perfectly right. And they get mad, and thus the devil gets advantage over them to destroy them. I told them I was but a man, and they must not expect me to be perfect. If they expected perfection from me, I should expect it from them. You're just the prophet of God. But if they would bear with my infirmities and the infirmities of the brethren, I would likewise bear with their infirmities. Everybody's making mistakes on all sides here, everybody. It's good people and bad people all on both sides. Now, it's not so much that they were displeased with his infirmities as they were displeased with his hypocrisy and lying. Those are different things, right? But it sure is generous of Joe to deal with their infirmities if they'll deal with his lying, cheating, and stealing, right? He concluded the meeting with, quote, I blessed them and departed. The company appeared to be in good spirits, end quote. It's his history. What do we expect to find in it? Now, During this time, of course, Emma continued to vacillate from deathly ill to mildly better for the remainder of October and November, which continued to occupy an inordinate amount of Joe's time. He took the family to see the newly completed temple floor in a wagon on November 1st, with the hopes that getting out of the house would help Emma feel better. It didn't, because primarily Joe crashed the wagon with the kids inside it after he had dropped Emma off. Apparently, the worst injury was felt by young Frederick Granger Williams Smith, then who was 6 years old, who got his head banged up pretty good and received a bruise on the cheek from it. But it was sure an intense situation, and Joe stood up and said, Are the children dead? Yeah, great, Dad. Good job, Dad. And now next, Whiteout Willard Richards also arrived back in town around this time after he had been preaching in the eastern states in order to combat the Bennett meltdown. Now, he was taken with an illness as well the very next day after he arrived. Hiram sidekick Abiff Smith, Wilson Law, Bloody Brigham Young, Heber the Creeper Kimball, George A. Smith, and Amasa Lyman, all members of the Quorum of Apostles of the Presidency, also returned from their missions in spreading propaganda to stem the tide of Bennett's scandalous claims. They apparently returned with good news, according to the history of the church anyway, so take that for what it's worth. Quote, they bring very good reports concerning the public feeling, and say that John C. Bennett's expose has done no hurt but much good. End quote. Bennett's expose, The History of the Saints, or an expose of Joe Smith and Mormonism, finally hit the shelves in its fully compiled and bound form. The book was over 350 pages of affidavits, of letters, and reprinted exposés from other authors, making the resounding case that Joseph Smith was a fraud and committing the crime of adultery at alarming rates. Further, the exposé detailed all of the political motivations of the Mormons, which caused its own stir in the minds of the Gentiles living near the Mormon settlement. Once again, a quick plug, patrons for the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. You're getting that book read in audiobook format along with my commentary to provide, context and some extra historical details. We're about halfway through the book right now. Joe and the Mormons were amidst a major campaign to use the publicity generated from this expose to their benefit, using the old model of there's no such thing as bad publicity. Of course, at the same time, bankruptcy proceedings were becoming a tangled mess. The paperwork necessary to file for bankruptcy was overwhelming. For Joe, for Hiram, for a number of the elites who were filing for bankruptcy. A list of assets and creditors needed to be submitted to the Illinois court to judge whether or not bankruptcy was possible or legal. This task occupied many of Joe's meetings with other church and city government officials throughout the remainder of 1842. Letters were exchanged back and forth among Joe's creditors, chief of which was Horace Hotchkiss. This is the guy who owned most of Nauvoo and sold it to Joe on insanely toxic terms. Joe's letter to him on November 26th reads in part, quote, I am as anxious as ever to have the contract continue good between us, and to meet the obligations specified in the contract. I am not, neither have I ever been wishful to shrink from it in any manner whatever, but intend to make payments as fast as my circumstances will admit. But, sir, you are not unacquainted with the extreme hardness of the times and the great scarcity of money, which put it out of my power to meet all the payments as they fell due, and which has been the cause of any failure on my part. And should you feel disposed not to press the payments, but offer a lenity equivalent to the state of the times, then, sire, I shall yet endeavor to make up the payments as fast as possible and consider the contract still good between us. I would here say that when I found it necessary to avail myself of the benefits of the bankrupt law, I knew not but that the law required of me to include you amongst the list of my creditors. Notwithstanding the nature of the contract between us, this explains the reason for my doing so. End quote. This letter from Joseph to Horace Hotchkiss, I mean, it wasn't just Horace Hotchkiss, but dozens of creditors who were constantly hounding Joseph Smith. By the end of 1842, Joe's red brick store had been running less than a year, but he'd almost completely bankrupted the company because people would come into the store to collect on debt that Joe owed them, and he would just pay from the stores on the shelves instead of selling the goods to replenish the missing inventory. Debt was completely overpowering Joe, and he was doing the only thing he knew how to do, hide and run. The end of this letter to Horace Hotchkiss reveals a lot of what was most likely happening with Sidney Rigdon and the mails that we discussed last episode. Quote, in regard to your having wrote me some few weeks ago, I will observe that I have received no communication from you for some months back. If you wrote to me, the letter has been broke open and detained, no doubt, as has been the case with a great quantity of letters from my friends of late, and especially within the last 3 months. Few, if any, letters for me can get through the post office in this place, and more particularly letters containing money and matters of much importance. I'm satisfied that Sidney Rigdon and others connected with him have been the means of doing incalculable injury not only to myself but to the citizens in general. And, sir, under such state of things, you'll have some idea of the difficulties I have to encounter and the censure I have to bear through the unjust conduct of that man and others whom he permits to interfere with the post office business." End quote. See, Joe was getting so many letters that demanded money that he didn't have. Now, he could answer them all the way that he had answered so many before, asking for their patience, which he did with Horace Hotchkiss in this letter, while he acquires the necessary money to repay them. But that's what an honest person would do. I think it's entirely plausible that the letters were getting to Joseph Smith and they were just piling up on his desk, and he just ignored them because nothing in Nauvoo history leads me to believe that Joe was honest or on top of things. He was just barely treading water with all of his responsibilities piling up. So it's a lot easier for Joe to just manufacture a conspiracy by Hingepin Sidney Rigdon that he was stealing letters all along. No, that letter you're asking for, $2,000 from me, I never got the letter. I don't know where it went. I mean, that sure would make a convenient excuse when somebody would come up to him in person and ask if he received any of the last 10 letters that they'd sent him that landed on his desk. A solution did exist to this in Joe's mind, and we'll get to that in a moment here. November 14th was an interesting meeting with the government and church leaders. Now, Nauvoo government sought to expand once again the rights of habeas corpus for the 4th time in 6 months. So yes, the original Nauvoo charter had the habeas corpus provision written into it, but it continued to be overruled by the governor, as should lawfully be the case. Yes, the governor supersedes a mayor in the pecking order of civil government. So what Joe did is amend the provision multiple times, each of these changes expanding on the previous. The latest change made it so any person arrested under any power from any government had the right to appeal to the municipal court of Nauvoo. Once the appeal was granted, by a Joe loyalist I would add, the prisoner simply wrote an explanation of why they shouldn't be detained, and the writ of habeas corpus would be granted. Under this revised provision, only if the arrest warrant specifically says the prisoner, quote, can neither be discharged nor admitted to bail nor in any other manner relieved, end quote, would the arrest warrant override this new habeas corpus provision issued by the municipal court. Now, beyond that, if the arrest warrant didn't pass the muster of the municipal court and a writ of habeas corpus was issued by the Nauvoo court, and the sheriff or constable refused to give up the prisoner for whatever reason, the city marshal of Nauvoo was now required to arrest the sheriff or constable on the spot. So essentially, sure, a sheriff could come into town and arrest Joseph Smith, but if his arrest warrant didn't have the right words in it, then Joe goes free. If it does have the right words in it and the Nauvoo court doesn't like it for whatever reason, then the sheriff had to give up Joseph Smith or he would be arrested by the Nauvoo marshal. Basically, if you arrest our prophet, we'll arrest you. Now, these efforts to continually expand the habeas corpus powers of Nauvoo continue to come in handy for the rest of Joe's life. Now, for a rare moment in Mormon history, November 15th marked an interesting development. Now, Joe was always quick to take on too many projects and was suffering under the weight of never seeing most of them to completion. One constant stressor on his life was acting as editor for the Times and Seasons. Newspaper editors are usually editors as a career, but Joe was editor of the Times and Seasons since it was established while still being prophet, vice mayor and then mayor of Nauvoo, commander-in-chief of the Nauvoo Legion, and everything else attached to his name. For once in his life, he decided to step away from a project that he thought was robbing too much of his time. So published in the Times and Seasons on November 15th was Joe's article entitled Valedictory. Quote, I beg leave to inform the subscribers of the Times and Seasons that it is impossible for me to fulfill the arduous duties of the editorial department any longer. The multiplicity of other business that daily devolved upon me renders it impossible for me to do justice to a paper so widely circulated as the Times and Seasons. I have appointed Elder John Taylor, who is less encumbered and fully competent to assume the responsibilities of that office, and I doubt not but that he will give satisfaction to the patrons of the paper. As this number commences a new volume, it also commences his editorial career. Signed, Joseph Smith. So now, with this notice, John Taylor would be the chief propaganda editor, while Whiteout Willard Richards was working as his assistant. A week after this was published, the brethren repeatedly met at the printing office to appraise it and to sign a new lease agreement that John Taylor and Willard Richards would control the times and seasons for 5 years from that time forward. Now, here's another interesting detail, and this is only interesting for what we're going to discuss near the end, so put a pin in this. On the same day of November 15th, an announcement was made in the history of the church. Quote, Elder Bradley Wilson died suddenly in his 74th year. He received the gospel in Ohio, removed his family to Missouri, and was driven to Nauvoo in 1839. He has left 7 sons and 39 grandchildren residing in Nauvoo. End quote. Now this guy, Bradley Wilson, makes no other appearance in the history of the church. And he must have been a close friend of Joe, or, he paid him favors, or whatever the case is. Even if he wasn't a Mormon elite with responsibilities in the church or city government, to merit mention in Joseph's journal as having died, leaving so many children and so many grandchildren, that means that he must have made an impact on Joe at some level. Now, like I said, this is an interesting detail, but doesn't mean much until we get to the end of this lightning round of history events. So put a pin in this Bradley Wilson guy, this mention/obituary here in the history of the church. Now, another interesting point. Joe gave a prophecy that was fulfilled in late 1842. What actually constitutes a prophecy by Joseph Smith is quite disputed depending on who's talking about what specific prophecy, but this one is remarkable, and it shows just how in tune Joe really was with God. On October 5th, he prophesied that even though the weather was warm and pleasant at the time, the Mississippi would be frozen over within a month. According to the history of the church, the prophecy was fulfilled to the day when a cold front rolled in and a couple of guys froze to death on the road from Carthage to Nauvoo. What a profound revelation for the mouthpiece of God. He prophesied that the river would freeze over in early October, and then it did in November. Who would have thought that it gets cold in November in Illinois? I'm amazed. Fulfilled prophecy. He's a true prophet. Another interesting development. Pistolpack and Porter found a place to roost for the winter in Philadelphia, from which he wrote a letter to his best friend Joe. Actually, Port didn't write this letter so much as he dictated it to a friend of his because Porter Rockwell was illiterate. Dear Brother Joseph Smith, I am requested by our friend Orrin Porter to drop a few lines informing you that he is in this place. His health is good, but his spirits are depressed, caused by his being unable to obtain employment of any kind. He has applied in different parts of the city and country, but all without success, as farmers can get persons to work from sunrise till dark for merely what they eat. He is most anxious to hear from you and wishes you to see his mother and children and write all particulars, how matters and things are and what the prospects are. I pity him from the bottom of my heart. His lot in life seems marked with sorrow, bitterness, and care. He is a noble, generous friend, but you know his worth. Any comments from me would be superfluous. He will wait in this place until he hears from you. Please write immediately, as 'twill be a source of great comfort for him to hear. End quote. Signed, S. Armstrong for Orrin Porter. So yes, Joe was a high-profile fugitive to get arrested, but he had the protection afforded by the Nauvoo Legion and thousands of sycophants if he ran into trouble. Pistolpack and Port, on the other hand, had no such protections, nor a source of income like Joe had. It's understandable that Port was in low spirits and depressed from the lack of contact with old friends and being removed from his home and children, possibly living in squalor until he could secure some regular income. That won't be an issue for Porter very soon. On December 5th, Joe attended meetings dealing with documenting assets and liabilities for the bankruptcy proceedings. That's pretty standard right now. He was spending a lot of time on this issue. What is interesting this day, though, is that he attended Masonic Lodge that evening, during which he brought up an accusation against Hinchpin Rigdon's son-in-law, George W. Robinson, for, quote, unmasonic conduct toward President Joseph, end quote. No further details. That could mean just about anything, but we can rest assured that it had at least a little bit to do with Joe suspecting that Rigdon and Robinson were colluding with Reckitt Bennett, even though the historical record doesn't really show evidence of that collusion. 2 days after this meeting was quite interesting as well. Joe dined with Elder Orson Hyde and family. Now, why is this important? Well, Orson Lachaidem, as we call him, had just returned that day from his mission to Jerusalem and probably had plenty of stories to tell Joe. But Joe had a few stories to tell Orson because Joe had married Orson's wife, Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde, just the previous April, while Orson was half the planet away on a mission for the church. Now, whether or not that little detail, between Joe and Marinda was actually told to Orson upon his return, that's a matter of complete historical mystery. However, the very next day, Joe records in his journal a meeting with Orson Hyde and his wife. No further details of that meeting survive. Now, we can't know if Orson was made privy to the fact that his wife was one of Joe's wives at the time, or exactly what transpired in these two meetings. It's worth noting that John D. Lee of Mountain Meadows Massacre fame testified in 1877 that Orson Hyde gave permission to Joe to take Marinda to be his plural wife. There's a lot of dispute as to the exact date that Marinda and Joe were sealed together because she testified in court that it happened in May of 1843, but Joe's journal accounts it in the handwriting of Thomas Bullock as April 1842. So nobody really knows for sure. Also, the level of involvement or knowledge of this transaction that Orson Hyde had, that's also highly disputed. Another interesting detail to add into the mix, Joe may have brokered some kind of deal with Orson Hyde for him to have Marinda as a plural wife because Orson was given his first plural wife 4 months after this in March of 1843 while Joe performed the marriage ceremony. Besides, Joe and Marinda probably had some history from when she was 16 years old back in Hiram, Ohio, when Joe was nearly castrated before being tarred and feathered. That was more than 10 years ago from where we are in our timeline, when Joe was living in the Johnson household with teenage Marinda Nancy Johnson. And, of course, you can find all of that back on episode 26, Joseph Smith, Broken or the Breaker. The next important issue that happened was the various newly elected government officials gave their inaugural speeches. According to the history of the church, the New Democrats may not have been what the Mormons were hoping for. At least that's not what their speeches seem to reveal. Quote, "This day, Thomas Ford, governor of Illinois, in his inaugural address to the Senate and House of Representatives, remarked that a great deal has been said about certain charters granted to the people of Nauvoo. These charters are objectionable on many accounts, but particularly on account of the powers granted. The people of the state have become aroused to this subject and anxiously desire that these charters should be modified so as to give the inhabitants of Nauvoo no greater privileges than those enjoyed by others of our fellow citizens." End quote. Good! That means that the new governor, Thomas Ford, wanted the Mormons to operate by the same rules as everybody else in the country. But no, of course, this was viewed as persecution. The Mormons were granted their charters and complete and total power in Nauvoo. Now they didn't want to give up those entitlements because it would threaten their ability to freely practice their religion. It's nice to know that these arguments have been going on for a lot longer than just the current news cycle. In the same session of these inaugural addresses, Jacob C. Davis, who will continue to figure more into our timeline as we move forward, also presented a resolution to the House of Representatives that the Nauvoo Charter should be repealed, which really was the best option at the moment to drain the swamp of all the Mormon corruption. That was the strategy eventually employed in 1845 when the Nauvoo Charter was actually repealed, which figured heavily into the Mormon exodus to the Great Basin. Jacob Davis also expressed a concern that the arms given to the Nauvoo Legion by Reckitt Bennett, because he was quartermaster general of the Illinois militia, that those arms and cannons should be seized by the state, effectively neutering the Legion from making any worthy stand against a rival militia should that militia choose to exert force upon Nauvoo. Should the legislature listen to Davis with his intelligent appeal, that would spell disaster for the Nauvoo Legion and the Mormons by extension. Another interesting detail in this 1842 election, Joe's younger brother, Crazy Willie Smith, was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives. Now, he wasn't elected a member of the federal Congress to represent Illinois, but to the state's House of Representatives to represent Hancock County, the county with Nauvoo in it. An indicator of a nepotistic color of the 1842 election is quite apparent when we see that Joe's own younger brother was elected by Nauvoo to represent the city at the state level. Now, Crazy Willie, in response to these various speeches, gave an impassioned speech to try and respond to Thomas Ford and Jacob Davis talking about repealing the incredible powers afforded to Nauvoo. The speech danced the line of trotting out all of the persecution the Mormons had suffered as refugees, while at the same time talking about how much the state needed the industriousness of the Mormons to survive. Crazy Willie responds to the point Davis made about taking the arms away by saying that the Nauvoo Legion doesn't even have the requisite number of arms afforded to them by state law, basically making the argument that the Nauvoo Legion should have even more guns than they had at the end of 1842. After his speech, Crazy Willie went back to Nauvoo, tendered his resignation from the Nauvoo Wasp, which was then transferred to John Taylor as the Times and Seasons had been done. He then met with Joe and Hiram, the three brothers, about what they should do with the political opposition, even though they had just given their votes to the governor and senator who would do them the most goods, the Democrats. They devised a plan to combat the assertions that the Nauvoo Charter should be repealed by invoking a slippery slope fallacy. The three Smith brothers concluded that if Illinois revokes Nauvoo's charter, then they'll have to revoke the charters for Springfield, Quincy, and Chicago as well, because the Nauvoo Charter was largely patterned after those cities. Now, the conflict wasn't so much that the Nauvoo Charter existed, so much as how the people of Nauvoo were using it. That was the real source of conflict. The Mormons were operating as a sovereign city-state within the boundaries of Illinois, and Governor Carlin had made a royal mess of trying to clean up the Mormon problem before he left office. The newly elected government officials wanted to employ whatever legal tools at their hands to strip Nauvoo of its power. Repealing the charter was only the first step to rooting out the Mormon corruption. December 15th was finally the day when Joe and Hiram's cases for bankruptcy were heard in front of the U.S. District Court of Illinois. Hiram was granted bankruptcy status, but Joe's hearing was put off until a later date, which ended up never taking place. Thus, Joe was never granted bankruptcy status. The governor-elect Thomas Ford got started immediately in planting his flag. He wanted the Mormons to know he wouldn't show them special favors. Now, Adam Snyder, he may have had less of a spine and played favorites with the Mormons had he been elected, but his death came after Joe had already declared the Mormon vote for the Democrats. Thus, Thomas Ford never had to curry favor with the Mormons to get their vote. He was just kind of inserted into Adam Snyder's place after Adam Snyder had probably made the promises that Thomas Ford never made. Now, it's quite interesting. He made it very clear in his first letter to Joseph Smith that he was in his office to faithfully execute the laws and duties of governor of Illinois. Joe, with a Mr. Butterfield representing him, sent a letter to Thomas Ford asking him to grant the writ of habeas corpus against any future arrest warrants coming out of Missouri and to acquit Joseph of the standing arrest warrant issued on the affidavit of ex-Governor Boggs of Missouri. This was Thomas Ford's reply, and it's extremely revealing of where he stood in relation to the Mormons. Quote, "Dear Sir, your petition requesting me to rescind Governor Carlin's proclamation and recall the writ issued against you has been received and duly considered. I submitted your case and all the papers relating thereto to the judges of the Supreme Court. They were unanimous in the opinion that the requisition from Missouri was illegal and insufficient to cause your arrest, but were equally divided as to the propriety and justice of my interference with the acts of Governor Carlin. It being, therefore, a cause of great doubt as to my power, and I not wishing even in an official station to assume the exercise of doubtful powers, and inasmuch as you have a sure and effectual remedy in the courts, I have decided to decline interfering. I can only advise you that you submit to the laws and have a judicial investigation of your rights. If it should become necessary for this purpose to repair to Springfield, I do not believe that there will be any disposition to use illegal violence towards you, and I would feel it my duty in your case, as in the case of any other person, to protect you with any necessary amount of force from mob violence while asserting your rights before the courts, going to and returning. I am most respectfully yours, signed Thomas Ford. End quote. Basically, Thomas Ford told Joe he wouldn't rescind the arrest warrant issued by Governor Carlin, as he and his council determined it to be a bad idea to interfere with affairs put in place by the previous governor. He then tells Joe to come to Springfield, just turn himself in, and plead his case that he should be released from arrest and extradition to Missouri, and also told him that he would defend Joe from any mob violence while he was pleading his case. But that's the catch, isn't it? Joe was required to turn himself in and appear in front of a legal court, not that sycophantic kangaroo court of Nauvoo, to plead his case. But Joe wasn't much for turning himself in. Joe's counsel, Josiah Butterfield, wrote a letter to Joe advising him to do what Governor Ford said and make an appearance before the Illinois Supreme Court, and that they would give him his writ of habeas corpus. Quote, "My advice is that you come here without delay, and you do not run the least risk of being protected while here. I will stand by you and see you safely delivered from your arrest." End quote. So, a lot of people are putting pressure on Joe to just turn himself in. Go to Springfield. Have the Supreme Court hear your case. You'll be released. Another interesting note in the history of the church. This is for December 20th, 1842. Here it is. Elder Lorenzo D. Barnes died this morning at 3:15 at Bradford, England. He is the first elder who has fallen in a foreign land in these last days. He had been long connected with the church, and had been distinguished both in his native land and in Great Britain for his piety and virtue, and great amiability of character, that endeared him much to all who knew him. He was one of the most active and efficient elders, and one whose labors were most extensive, and was eminently successful in his ministry. And while we lament his loss, yet we mourn not for him as without hope, knowing that shortly he shall come forth in the resurrection of the just, and stand in his lot at the last day. End quote. Have you ever heard that name before? Lorenzo D. Barnes? Has that come up in our timeline? No. No, you haven't. I haven't either. He's never come up before now. He's just an elder in England who happened to be, the first elder of the church to die in the service of the church while in a foreign land. And that's remarkable, but he didn't particularly influence our timeline whatsoever. Now, just like the last mention of a death in this episode, the Bradley Wilson guy, put a pin in this Lorenzo D. Barnes guy. We'll get to why I'm emphasizing these deaths momentarily. Next, and final order of business for 1842. Whiteout Willard Richards was inducted into the office of official secretary and historian of Joseph Smith, his personal secretary and historian. Granted, Joe had William Clayton as a personal scribe, but that's not a secretary. William Clayton kept Joe's personal journal. He transcribed his letters into his letter book. He acted as scribe for public meetings of the Quorum of Apostles and Masonic lodges, so on and so forth. Willard Richards, however, was given the primary task of compiling Joe's history to be published in the Times and Seasons. He took minutes of the more secretive meetings with just the few intellectual elites, and he worked directly with John Taylor in the Times and Seasons and the WASP to correlate the Nauvoo propaganda machine, disseminating information throughout the country. William Clayton had an important role in keeping Joe's records. Whiteout Willard Richards had the important role of making sure that Joe looked good to the rest of the world. You see, John Goebbels Whitmer had been excommunicated 4 years prior to now. Now it was time for Joe to have a new official propaganda agent. We have Whiteout Willard Richards to thank for the 7-volume history of the church, which constructed the initial narrative of Joe's life and the history of the church during his ministry. So, from the birth of Joe and Emma's stillborn child, to the Greek Psalter incident, the Masonic Lodge and the Mormon Ascendancy Ritual, the Book of Abraham, the Relief Society being organized, the assassination of an ex-governor of Missouri, multiple parades and, drills by the Nauvoo Legion, the Bennett meltdown and all of the fire resulting from his exposés and lectures, dozens of public works projects, hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt accruing interest and consistently defaulting on the loans, the Red Brick Store, arrested and released and continually evading arrest, all while taking to wife Agnes Moulton Coolbrith, his brother's widow, Sylvia Porter Sessions Lyon, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, Patty Bartlett Sessions, Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde, Elizabeth Davis Brackenbury Durfee, Sally Ann Fuller, Sarah Marietta Kingsley Howe Cleveland, Delsina Johnson, Eliza R. Snow, Sarah Ann Whitney, Martha McBride, and Sarah Babson. 1842 was truly Joseph Smith's busiest year to this point in his 12 years of ministry. Those are just the high points, most of which we've covered on this show, but there were hundreds of smaller interactions and events nestled between all these major events. Nauvoo Mormonism is absolutely insane. We started 1842 with episode 98. Now, 36 episodes later, we finally covered a single year of Nauvoo Mormonism. Further, this has been a mini-series within the historical timeline that we have dubbed the Bennett Meltdown. Today's show is episode 10 of that mini-series, which brings it to a close. Now, that's not to say that the Bennett Meltdown is actually over, as the leadership will be dealing with the fallout from Reckitt Bennett's exposés for years to come. But the end of 1842, it seems like an organic place to bring this Bennett Meltdown to a close. Now we can start off 2019 fresh in 1843 with a clean slate. Except for one thing. I told you all to put a pin in the 2 notices about those 2 guys dying. We first had Bradley Wilson, then we had Lorenzo D. Barnes in England who had died. Members of Nauvoo and England Mormon leadership who've never made an appearance on our timeline before, each getting their own mention in the Times and Seasons newspaper and, by extension, in the history of the church. These guys, both of whom didn't have a noticeable impact on Mormonism aside from the people they, converted and maybe the public works projects that they may have helped on, like the temple or the Nauvoo house, or, maybe Lorenzo Barnes helped with the Millennial Star printing in England. But these guys are absolutely not important to our timeline whatsoever. But the reason I'm going to ask you to take the pin out of them is because Nauvoo Mormonism lost somebody in October 1842 who has had a much greater impact on the church in ways which can't be easily summarized. Further, this person's death, for whatever reason, didn't merit mention in the local Nauvoo newspapers, while these other 2 guys did. And I can't wrap my mind around that fact. This man was one of the earliest members of the church who converted in Kirtland. He was one of the original 5 missionaries to make their way to Missouri to proselytize to the Native Americans. He provided income to the Smith family in Kirtland when he leased out his farm to Joseph Sr., Big Daddy Cheese. He owned the land that the Kirtland Temple was built on that he donated to the church. He was second counselor to Joseph Smith in the presidency of the church, superseding even the great Oliver Cowdery. This man gave an affidavit in 1840 stating, quote, "In consequence of mobocracy, together with Governor Boggs' exterminating order, I was compelled to leave the state under great sacrifice of real property, which has reduced and left myself and family in a state of poverty with a state of delicate health and an advanced stage of life." End quote. He's been there since the earliest days of Kirtland, all through Missouri, and now all throughout Nauvoo. This man had been a personal doctor of the Smiths, keeping many of the Mormons alive during their exodus from Missouri to Quincy, Illinois, tending to the needs of the people when sicknesses took over. He'd sewn up Hiram's sidekick Abiff's arm after he cut it to the bone while chopping wood. This guy was one of the earliest members of the church, one of the people who sacrificed the most tangible wealth to Joseph Smith, and was a printer and scribe for the prophet for half a decade, all while running his practice as a botanic physician. Joseph and Emma even named one of their sons after this man. Frederick G. Williams. His health had been declining since the exodus to Illinois. He had one final meeting with Joe, told through the eyes of his teenage daughter, quote, "Late in the summer of 1842, they paid another visit to Nauvoo. When the time came to leave, the prophet held Frederick closely and said sadly, 'Brother Frederick, I do not like to see you leave. You are going home to die.' Frederick answered, 'I am already a dead man.'" End quote. And on October 10th, 1842, Freddie G. Willie died a little before his 55th birthday. No notice ran in the Times and Seasons. His death was never recorded in the history of the church. He had one brief mention in the Quincy Whig, but that was an anti-Mormon newspaper, which just said, quote, "Died in this city on the 10th instant, Dr. F.G. Williams," end quote. That's it. Williams' gravesite was unknown to historians until it was discovered in the early 2000s when his descendant, a professor at BYU by the same name, dedicated a new headstone to him. Otherwise, Freddie G. Willie has been all but forgotten in Mormon history. Joe didn't speak at his funeral, as would be expected. It was just that one final goodbye. For that very reason, we're going to do our best to memorialize Dr. Frederick G. Williams here on this show. He's kind of a personal hero of me because he figured so heavily into Kirtland Mormonism, and he's an important piece of the Smith entheogen theory. So next week, I'm going to air the presentation that Cody and I did at Sunstone, Seattle in November of 2018. I've uncovered some very interesting details concerning Frederick G. Williams, largely with thanks to his descendant who wrote the Williams biography, and I want to share that research here on this podcast. But that's not all. Patrons of the show over at patreon.com/NakedMormonism, you're going to get access to a super secret special presentation I did, which greatly expands on this Sunstone presentation that will be aired on the regular feed. This presentation was given for a local meetup group in Davis County, organized by our awesome production assistant, Julie Briscoe, and it ran for a little bit over 2 hours. But even at 2 hours, we barely even scratched the surface of old Freddie G. Willie. It was a very intimate setting, and we discussed very candidly entheogens and other psychedelics with the group. So if you want to hear it, be sure to check it out on the Patreon feed of the podcast, where, we're going to do our best to give Freddie G. Willie a proper send-off from our historical timeline. So even though his death was not memorialized in Nauvoo newspapers, nor was it even mentioned, Frederick G. Williams' impact on early Mormonism simply cannot be overstated. He won't be forgotten to us. We have our own heroes in our little world of post-Mormonism. One of those heroes for thousands of people, yours truly included, is Brother Jake. Now, you heard about this last week, but Brother Jake Frost had a cardiac event of some kind, and he has been getting a little bit better. And this is, it happened on the very end of November. Here's the most recent update. Huge changes have happened in the last 5 days. Jake moved from the Neuro ICU to a step-down unit in cardiothoracic surgery. As one of his nurses put it, "You're not ICU material, and I mean that as a compliment." The changes he has undergone there have been remarkable. Jake is conscious, talking some, though it hurts due to the tracheotomy, and eating. He is able to drink and eat using his left hand. He is regaining movement with his right hand. He went from briefly chuckling on Monday night to laughing on Wednesday to joking on Saturday. Some quotes from Jake, growling first words: "I'm fine, no gracias. I am just so grateful, and I'm so fucking bored." It is unclear what he remembers before the event. It is common in hospitals to have delirium when you come out of a situation like this. We're currently looking into rehab facilities, which is where he will go after he leaves the hospital, to work on speech therapy, physical therapy, and occupational therapy. It will likely be after the holidays. And it continues a little bit after that. That's the most recent update as of December 15th. So that's fantastic news for Brother Jake, and we're trying to help any way that we can. So Mark Elwood of theglasslooker.com and I have teamed up to do the fundraiser the only way that we know how, and that's with our creative talents. So Mark is an illustrator and I'm a storyteller. We want to reward those who donate to help Jake and his family with their medical bills, because let's face it, they're going to be crushed by them. I'm writing anybody who donates into a treasure dig, and Mark is going to be illustrating you into that treasure dig. So if you want to be included in the treasure dig, pull your phone out of your pocket right now. Yeah, I'm talking to you. You listening to this right now, I'm talking to you. Pull your phone out, go to your web browser, put in gofundme.com/gojakego. Go ahead. We're all waiting. Go. That's right. All right. You have it open? Okay. You see that green bar on the top of the screen? That means that this campaign is funded. But you know as well as I do that $20,000 isn't going to take the Frost family very far with the American healthcare system as it is. Let's see how big we can make that number. Can we hit 25,000? Maybe 30,000? Maybe those goals are too lofty, but his wife and 1-year-old child, they sure could use any amount of money that you guys are willing to donate. So you got the browser open, right? So now hit the donate now button, okay? And put in whatever amount you feel comfortable with. If you donate any amount, you get a shout out on the show. If you donate $50 or more, you get written into the treasure dig. Now, this treasure dig, we'll talk about it in a second here. If you donate $100, not only do you get written into the treasure dig, but Mark Elwood will draw you into the treasure dig and email you a high-resolution image to keep for posterity's sake. So now that you've hit the donate button, you just received an email receipt, right? Simply forward that receipt email to nakedmormonism@gmail.com so I know who to thank or what name to write into the treasure dig. If you donate over the $100 threshold, be sure you attach a picture of yourself or anything that you want drawn into that treasure dig, kind of like Mike Montague did with himself and his dog that somebody's choking in the picture. And you can see it for yourself if you scroll down on the GoFundMe page, because I know that your phone is open and you're looking at it right now, right? So on January 3rd, we're going to air the Treasure Dig episode and distribute the illustrations to anybody who donated. Now, the Treasure Dig episode, it's going to be... Did you like the Jonas Pierce History of Liverpool episode? It's going to be something quite a bit like that. So once again, go to gofundme.com/gojakego. And if you're wondering who the hell this guy is that we're doing this fundraiser for, go search Brother Jake on YouTube. Find out for yourself. You owe it to yourself. All right, that's going to wrap it up for today. We're going to thank new patrons after this fundraising drive is over, so don't sign up a Patreon. Donate instead to Go Jake Go on GoFundMe for the rest of the year. And, of course, as always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as production assistant and director of social media, and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is produced by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com and is used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnome Studios, LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved. Couple of random thoughts.